My name is Samantha Carter, and right now I'm standing in the cold October rain outside St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan. My dress blues soaked through, metals gleaming under the drop of every raindrop, while the rest of my family laughs inside without me. I should feel hurt, maybe even a flicker of shame, but instead I'm clutching something in my coat pocket. A little metal Starlink chip etched with two simple words Grandpa whispered to me years ago for kiddo. That chip is my talisman tonight, a reminder that somewhere inside this uniform and behind every protocol-driven move, there's a girl who learned to tie her first pair of boots because someone believed in her. But at this moment, as the church doors close behind the people who share my blood, I'm not the Carter they think they know. I'm the one they branded unworthy, the one they barred from saying goodbye. And I'm thinking, this is just the beginning. When I first joined the U.S. Space Force 20 years ago, I never imagined I'd rise to the rank of Major General, the youngest female general in my branch. But neither did I ever think I'd be fighting my own family. I enlisted because I needed to build my life on my own terms, measured by actions, not by the shape of my hair or the cut of my jacket. Boot camp turned my soft hands into calloused tools of survival. Deployments hardened my resolve, and every promotion felt like proof that I could matter, even if they never noticed. I sent home postcards from remote satellite stations, helmet in hand, hoping for a note in return. Nothing. I mailed birthday cards, holiday gifts, letters pleading for a simple acknowledgement. Silence. Some wounds don't bleed. They echo like unanswered phone calls in an empty house. Back then, I convinced myself it was only neglect, a lack of understanding, that I was forging a path they couldn't see. But tonight it feels different. I remember the last time I walked back through those doors on Cedar Street after a 7-month red zone deployment. Dusty boots uniform, rumpled exhaustion in every bone. I shuffled through the mail and found a letter from my bank. I ripped it open with the kind of half-asleep grip you give a bill you don't want to read. Except when I logged into my account on my phone, the balance glared back at me in red minus $624,000. Negative. My breath hitched so hard I thought I might choke. I refreshed the screen. Same result. My savings gone. My investment fund empty. My retirement contributions wiped. At first, I thought there was a glitch, a typo. But then I saw the pattern: small withdrawals, recurring transfers escalating into 6-figure sums, funneled into accounts I didn't own. My finger hovered over the Contact Fraud Department button, but I already knew exactly where to point the blame. I traced the digital breadcrumbs back to the only place they could originate, one I'd naively trusted with every deposit I ever made. Cedar Street, my parents, my sister Victoria. The world spun so fast I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles flipped white. I didn't cry, I didn't sob. I only felt the cold certainty that betrayal doesn't announce itself, it seeps in, drop by drop, until you're drowning. So I did what any Space Force officer would. I initiated a mission. Under the guise of a routine operation, I accessed secure channels, just enough to pull down a read-only snapshot of blockchain records tied to the Carter estate. The Starlink chip Grandpa gave me wasn't just a sentimental keepsake. It contained the encrypted hash of Grandpa's final will, stored and timestamped in distributed ledgers. I had Claire Reed, my old JAG colleague, verify the integrity of the data. Every transaction, every signature, every unauthorized transfer, there it was in neon clarity against the hum of servers. My family had been siphoning off my life savings for years, and I hadn't known until now. It hurt in ways explosives never could. Because this wasn't some stranger hacking a retirement fund. This was my own blood carving scars into my trust. I could almost hear their voices in my head. You're too far away to manage this. You're not cut out for finance. You'll never fit in our world. They didn't steal because they needed to. They stole because they could convince that family takes care of family, even if that care meant hollowing me out when I wasn't looking. And yet, as furious as I burned on the inside, I stayed calm on the outside. That's the difference between a snap judgment and a calculated strike. I gathered evidence like a squadron readying for target lock. By day, forensic accountant Charles Yates had collated over 200 pages of bank statements, forged authorizations, and shell corporations tied to our parents' and sisters' names. Every dollar had a trail. But knowing facts isn't enough to win a war. You need the right theater. I reached out quietly to Jasmine Torres, the investigative reporter at the New York Times, who'd covered my Space Force promotions. I asked her off the record if she could stand by in case things went sideways. I didn't want head-on confrontation. I wanted a spectacle that could never be ignored. That morning, I drove across town to the white brick house on Cedar Street where I grew up. The lawn was manicured as always, the shutters freshly painted, the rose garden blooming with the same obsessive care Mom insisted on. Inside, Dad was thumbing through the Wall Street Journal, Mom cradling her porcelain teacup, and Victoria was posing for an influencer live stream about her latest tech venture. They looked up surprised when I stepped into the foyer. Sam, Mom said, voice clipped. "We didn't expect, I know." I interrupted, voice steady, military precise. "I'm here to talk about the missing money." A silence so thick you could slice it hung in the air. Dad lowered his paper. Victoria set down her phone. I laid the first folder on the mahogany table. $624,000, I said. "That's how much you've taken from me over the past 5 years." Mom's hand trembled. Victoria's lips curled into a contemptuous half-smile. "We thought we were protecting you." Mom replied, soft as a lullaby. "You're always away. You don't understand money like we do." It was the same patronizing tone they'd used my whole life. The tone that said, "You belong on the outside." I felt the familiar swell of anger, but I choked it back. "Protecting me," I repeated, watching the edges of Dad's face twitch. "You call wire transferring my retirement contributions protection?" Victoria laughed and slapped her thigh. "Oh, come on, Sam. You don't even know what you'd do with that kind of cash. You're a soldier, not a Wall Street wunderkind." That line cut deeper than any sniper's bullet. Because I had spent years proving I could lead satellite strikes, coordinate rescue ops, but I had never had to prove I could wrest back what was mine from the people who should have been proud. I took a breath and pressed my palms flat on the table. "Let me be clear," I said, voice low. "I want every dollar back, and I don't want excuses. I want your signatures on the transfer orders by noon tomorrow. Or else I file criminal charges." They blinked, stunned. I let the silence hang, then turned on my heel and walked out, the chandelier light flickering behind me like a signal flare. I didn't look back, because I knew that some battles you win when your opponent realizes you won't hesitate to follow through. That night, I sat alone in my Times Square apartment, the city's neon glow bleeding through the curtains. Next to me lay the Starlink chip in its protective case, the last gift from the one person who'd ever truly seen me. I slid it into my laptop's reader and watched the blockchain proof of Grandpa's will unfold in cryptic code. He had left everything to me: the house, the investments, the seed money for the veterans shelter I'd pitched last Christmas. I traced my finger over the shiny surface of the chip, thinking about all the years I'd spent chasing validation from people who never gave it, only to find that Grandpa's belief in me was etched not in sentiment, but in steel and code. As I leaned back, my phone buzzed. A text from Jasmine. "I'm live at St. Patrick's. Got your back." My pulse quickened. Tomorrow at Grandpa's funeral, they'd finally see me for who I am. Not the black sheep in their perfect little portrait, but the general who commands squadrons, leverages cutting-edge tech, and refuses to be erased. I slipped my uniform jacket over the back of the sofa, staring at the rank insignia, 2 silver stars reflecting in the coffee table's glass top. The image of F-35s slicing through Manhattan's morning mist flashed in my mind, a silent promise that I wasn't alone. I stood and walked to the window, rain still falling outside, people hurrying by with umbrellas and coffee in hand, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. My reflection stared back at me, crisp uniform, unbroken posture, eyes steely. I touched the Starlink chip in my pocket one more time and whispered, "This is for you, Grandpa." Then I turned away, heart pounding with anticipation, and a flicker of something I haven't felt in a long time: hope. Tomorrow I wouldn't just demand the justice Grandpa inscribed for me. I'd make my family witness it live undeniable as gravity. And in that moment, as the city hum pulsed around me, I realized that crossing the street to fight was nothing compared to the courage it took to face the ones who raised me. Tomorrow, everything changes. I parked 2 blocks away from St. Patrick's Cathedral, heart pounding like a drumline, as I stepped out of my SUV and into the chilly October morning. The sky was the color of pewter, and the wet pavement caught every flicker of neon from taxicabs and phone screens. Under my arm was a slim folder containing a certified copy of Grandpa's will. And in my pocket, the Starlink chip he'd given me years ago. The same one I'd used last night to prove my inheritance was real, stored on a blockchain so ironclad, even my family's lawyers couldn't tamper with it. I looked at the chip, its metal surface cool against my fingertips, and I felt the smallest flicker of calm. Whatever happened today, at least I had this proof that I wasn't forgotten, that someone had seen me when no one else cared. I straightened the collar of my dress blues, making sure my rank insignia gleamed, and walked toward the cathedral steps. As I approached, I saw them, the dozen Marines in ceremonial dress, lining up in perfect formation, their boots clicking in unison as they approached the entrance. Behind them, a squadron of F-35s carved vapor trails overhead, a flyover timed to the exact minute Grandpa's service was set to begin. Cameras from local news crews zeroed in on the planes, then shifted to me framed in the doorway, like a portrait I'd never wanted but could no longer ignore. Reporters whispered into microphones. Major General Samantha Carter, the scandal-plagued heiress turned Space Force leader. My chest tightened as dozens of strangers watched, waiting for me to react. I took a slow breath, then stepped onto the top stair, each footfall measured deliberate, until I stood eye level with my parents and sister on the stone landing. My mother's face was pale tight with shock. Dad's jaw was clenched so hard I thought his knuckles might crack. Victoria's perfect posture wavered her designer heels, threatening to slip on the slick marble. Behind them, cousins' neighbors, and a scattering of well-wishers formed a semicircle, smartphones held high. I could see the reflection of my own uniform in their lenses, a mirror that showed me more than I'd ever let them see. I met my mother's eyes, and for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. "Good morning," I said, voice calm enough that reporters lowered their mics, sensing the gravity in my tone. "I'm here to honor my grandfather's memory and to ensure his last wishes are fulfilled." I stepped aside to let the Marines pass. They marched past in flawless precision, rifles held tight, faces impassive. When General Marshall emerged, 4 stars glinting on his shoulders, he removed his cover and saluted me. "Major General Carter, ma'am," he said, voice low but carrying. "We are honored to stand with you." The moment crackled like static electricity. My parents' mouths opened and closed like fish out of water. My sister's eyes filled with panic. She couldn't hide behind her mascara. And all I felt was the steady pride of someone who finally belonged, not to them, but to herself. Once the salute was returned, I motioned to Claire Reed, my JAG attorney, who stepped forward holding a slim tablet. With a tap, she projected a holographic image onto the cathedral's facade. Grandpa's will digitally signed and notarized with my name as the sole beneficiary. Below it, red highlighted ledger entries showed every unauthorized transfer from my personal accounts into shell corporations registered under my family's names. A hush fell. The murmurs stuttered. Someone gasped. I watched my father's face drain of color as the evidence rolled across the stone like a ticker tape. My sister shrieked, "Stop this! You can't do this here!" But her voice was swallowed by the cathedral's echoing acoustics. I raised a hand. I said, voice flat. "This is my grandfather's house of worship, but it's also his legacy, and today we're honoring both." Reporters clicked away, live streams blazed to hundreds of thousands of viewers. And somewhere in the distance, I heard Jasmine Torres's voice crack. "This is unprecedented," Major General Carter, publicly exposing her family's fraud at her own grandfather's funeral. The irony was so sharp I almost smiled. Almost. When Claire finished the projection, she handed me the tablet. I held it up like a victor's cup, as though lifting Grandpa's spirit alongside it. "My grandfather believed in service," I said, scanning the crowd. "He believed in integrity. I chose a career where every order I give can mean life or death. It's time that the people who took from me learn what it feels like to face consequences." My words cut through the damp air, and for a moment, I felt like the rain had stopped. But ceremonies must proceed, so I stepped aside. The Marines formed a line down the steps, presenting arms in salute, and a bugler struck up taps. I closed my eyes, letting the mournful notes wash over me, feeling each vibration in my chest like a benediction. Then the doors swung open, and we walked inside. The interior of St. Patrick's was hushed and golden-stained glass filtering sunlight onto stone pews. Normally, this place would smell of incense and polished wood. Today, it smelled of rain and the faint tang of fear. Family slipped into the front row, Dad and Mom on my right. Victoria on my left, faces, stony eyes glued to the floor. I took my seat on the dais just behind the lectern where Reverend O'Malley would speak. I was supposed to stand at attention during the eulogy, but I let myself slide down into the chair, hands resting on my thighs. My uniform felt like armor and a cage, at the same time protection and burden entwined. I wanted to look at them to see guilt flicker in their eyes. Instead, I stared at the front of the church, at the flickering candles guarding Grandpa's casket. He looked peaceful, like he'd fallen asleep waiting for us to get here. I whispered, "We did it, kiddo," and pressed the Starlink chip to my lips, a quiet prayer of gratitude. Reverend O'Malley's voice rose, echoing off the arches. He spoke of Grandpa's wartime valor, his kindness to orphans, the time he quietly funded the local community center without seeking credit. The crowd nodded, tears glistening. My family sat stiff as mannequins. When it was my turn, I hadn't planned to speak. Funerals aren't for speeches. But Claire slipped me a folded index card with 8 lines of text, the exact quotes from Grandpa's will that mattered most. I unfolded it, took a breath, and stepped to the microphone. "I want to thank you all for being here." I began, voice steady. "My grandfather taught me that service isn't about gratitude. It's about duty. He left behind more than memories. He left behind a mission to care for those who protected our freedom." I looked out at the faces veterans in the back row, their medals like dull stars on plain suits. Cousins wiping tears, strangers mouthing along, and I felt the power of connection, the way stories bind us. Then I held up the chip. He encoded his final wishes here on this device. Everything he owned, his house, his savings, his hopes, was to go to a fund for veterans in need. Gasps fluttered through the congregation. My sister's shoulders shook. Dad's head lolled. Mom's lips trembled. I paused, letting it sink in. "So this fund," I said, voice softening, "will open its doors next week right here in Manhattan. A place for veterans to heal, to find community, no questions asked." At those words, I thought I'd feel triumph. But instead, I felt something strange relief, like releasing a held breath, and a nagging hollow where I'd imagined joy should bloom. After the service, the crowd filed out in a blur of umbrellas and murmured condolences. I slipped away from the cathedral steps, heading for the coffee cart, parked discreetly in an alley, my own little quiet table, where I'd set up a nonprofit breakfast service in Grandpa's honor. I'd spent part of my inheritance stocking it with fresh pastries, hot coffee, folding chairs. Today, instead of veterans, I found reporters circling the table like vultures. They snapped photos of blueberry muffins and steaming cups, scribbled notes about my charitable optics. I felt that old sting, the sense of being misunderstood, misrepresented. But then a voice called out, "General Carter." I looked up to see a man with silver-streaked hair and a jacket patched with Vietnam-era insignia. He held out a paper cup. "Coffee's on me. Thank you for staying true." His eyes were soft, recognizing me not as a headline, but as one of their own. I took the cup, and we shared a silent nod, a pact between strangers bound by service. Around us, the journalists sneered, but I didn't care. I sipped the coffee, bitter strong alive, and felt something stir, a conviction that real change happens here in small moments of connection, not on stone steps under flashing lights. As I packed up the quiet table, folding chairs, empty cups, leftover bagels, a news alert buzzed on my phone. Breaking Carter family's emergency motion to block Veterans Fund files in Manhattan court. My heart stumbled. I tapped the notification. They'd engaged Martin Gallagher, a hotshot civil attorney, famous for injunctions and restraining orders. If he got a temporary restraining order, the fund couldn't operate, and the will's provisions would be tied up in litigation for months, maybe years. My jaw tightened. This wasn't a battlefield I'd trained for. This was a courtroom where money and influence weighed more than truth. But I'd prepared for this. I slipped the Starlink chip out of my pocket and pressed it into my palm, feeling its weight. Grandpa had stored his legacy here, distributed across nodes around the world. A judge couldn't delete it. A lawyer couldn't override it. It existed beyond paper, beyond ink. I let that thought anchor me. I looked up at the cathedral's shadowed spire, rain clouds scudding across its limestone facade. Somewhere inside, my family was reeling, scrambling for counterattacks. But I had ahead of me a path lit by code and community, by service and solidarity. I straightened up, folded the table, and packed it into the back of my SUV, resolved that tonight I'd meet Claire and Charles to file opposition briefs, prepare affidavits, rally our witnesses. The risk was real. If we lost in court, all those veterans counting on us would be left out in the cold. But I had purpose clearer than ever. And as I drove away, city lights reflecting off the wet asphalt, I spoke to the Starlink chip one last time. Let's get to work, kiddo. The fight wasn't over. It was only just begun. Soon, they'd learn that justice, like space itself, cannot be contained. I pulled into the parking garage beneath Claire's office, the overhead lights humming like distant generators, and took a deep breath before stepping into the sterile corridor. My heart was still racing from the morning's news alert. Martin Gallagher had filed an emergency motion to block Grandpa's Veterans Fund, claiming the will on the Starlink chip was inadmissible because it lacked a wet ink signature. I gripped the little metal disc in my palm, cold, unyielding a lifeline to everything Grandpa had entrusted me with, then let it rest in my coat pocket as I knocked on Claire's door. Inside, Claire and Charles Yates, the forensic accountant, were crouched over a conference table strewn with binders, laptops, and half-empty coffee cups. Marcus Lee, my old NSA contact, lounged against the wall, arms folded, eyes sharp behind wireframe glasses. "Morning, Sam," Claire said, looking up. "We've got counters to file before noon. Gallagher's arguing the blockchain ledger is hearsay, no jurisdiction, blah blah. He's also produced a paper we'll sign it 2 weeks before Grandpa's death, naming my parents as co-trustees." My chest tightened. A paper will... Did Grandpa ever mention that? I asked, voice low. Claire shook her head. "Not that I know of. Our chip's timestamp is 3 months prior, long after he'd drawn up his original estate plan. But state law gives primacy to holographic wills if properly executed." I ran a hand through my hair, adrenaline spiking. So now we're fighting on 2 fronts: digital authenticity and whether a handwritten will supersedes the chip. Marcus stepped forward. "Not if we prove the chip's data is unalterable. I've prepared testimony on the immutability of distributed ledgers, chain of custody node, verification logs." Charles chimed in. "And I've cross-reconciled every transaction record with bank statements. There's no indication Grandpa ever revoked or replaced the digital will. Those shell corporations for Victoria's startup, they show transfers after the alleged paper will's date." I nodded, feeling that familiar surge of clarity that comes when you latch onto a plan. But every victory carried risk. If we lost, I'd not only lose the fund, but also the public's trust. I met Claire's gaze. "We file our opposition today line by line. Then we call Marcus and Charles to the stand, lay out the blockchain proof, bring in Dr. Naomi Patel on Grandpa's mental fitness. She evaluated him after his stroke in 22. She'll confirm he was lucid, intended the chip as his final directive." Claire tapped her pen. "Ethan Carter is willing to testify too. He recorded a conversation with Mom and Dad last Thanksgiving, mentions the chip, Grandpa's insistence on digital archiving. Ethan, the oddest ally, my youngest brother, who'd disappeared from our lives after I enlisted, had resurged to help. His presence was a beacon of hope." I exhaled, gathering my composure. "All right, let's move." We spent the next hour drafting briefs, annotating exhibits, emailing reporters that we'd hold a press conference if Gallagher touched the fund. Outside the courtroom, I stood under an umbrella with Jasmine Torres, who'd promised live coverage. We exchanged a quick nod, no smiles. Then I walked into the chambers. The judge, a woman with steely eyes and silver hair, peered at the filings. Gallagher's team argued Grandpa's original estate plan was in his safe deposit box, so the court should honor that. Claire stood, voice steady. "Your Honor, the digital will was notarized, time-stamped, and publicly recorded on a secure blockchain. It reflects my client's last known intent. Moreover, the paper will lack witnesses. Under New York Surrogates Court Procedure Act, holographic wills require 3 attesting witnesses, which this one lacks." The judge scanned the chip, the printed ledger, the motion to vacate. Time slowed. I felt the Starlink chip throb in my pocket like a heartbeat. Finally, she peered at Gallagher's counsel and said, "I'm inclined to deny the injunction, but I'll review in detail. Status tomorrow at 9. The room exhaled. Press cameras clicked. Reporters rushed to my side microphones, thrust forward General Carter. Any comment, I squared my shoulders and said, "Justice moves slowly, but it moves." Then I slipped out the rain, outside, softened to drizzle. Jasmine snapped photos. "People are with you, Sam. Online sentiments, 70% pro-fund." I offered a half grin. "Then let's keep it that way." Back at the quiet table later that afternoon, I found veterans lining up for coffee and bagels. I poured the brews, handed out fruit, and felt their gratitude in nods and murmured thanks. Here my uniform meant something tangible, a lifeline, not a headline. But in the back of my mind, I heard the judge's words, inclined to deny. Tomorrow was a cliff's edge. That night, I met Naomi Patel in her compact office near Columbia. She'd arranged mental fitness evaluations from Grandpa's last year notes affirming full capacity. She explained how emotions and memory work, how betrayal can warp your trust, but also steal your resolve. She pressed a cup of chamomile into my hands and said, "You're carrying not just numbers on a ledger, Sam, but your own worth." I let the words sink in. Then I slipped back into my apartment and found Ethan waiting by the window, gazing at the city lights. He handed me a USB drive. "More evidence," he said. "Mom's voicemails, she left messages about the chip's importance before she knew about the paper will." My throat tightened. I accepted the drive as if it were oxygen. As he left, I thought about how twisted loyalty could become when wrapped in entitlement. The chip lay on my desk, shining under the lamp's glow. I touched it gently and whispered, "Tomorrow, kiddo." Then I sat at my laptop, assembling our final exhibits for the hearing. Each file I attached felt like a step toward reclaiming not just Grandpa's legacy, but my own identity. Outside, the city pulsed with life, nylon umbrellas, taxi horns, neon signs. Inside, I felt a calm resolve tighten around me like armor. In the morning, I'd face the judge again, I'd call witnesses, I'd lay out the cold facts. And if the court ruled in my favor, the veterans would have their fund. If not, something deeper would shatter inside me. I stared at the chip one last time, before lights out a promise etched in metal and memory. Tomorrow was the crucible. I arrived at the surrogate's court just as the sun peeked through a bruised sky, the marble steps still slick from overnight drizzle, and I could feel my heart thudding against my ribs like a warning. I found a quiet corner by the entrance to check my notes one last time, smoothing the crease in the binders that held Marcus's ledger proof, Naomi's medical affidavits, Ethan's voicemail files, and Charles's accounting exhibits. In my breast pocket, the Starlink chip lay tucked against my uniform jacket's inner lining, cold, unshakable, like a compass pointing me toward Grandpa's final intention. I took a breath, feeling the weight of every veteran who counted on this fund pressing down on my shoulders. If we lost today, their breakfasts, their moment of fellowship at the quiet table would vanish into a tangle of appeals. The risk was greater than any mission I'd ever led overseas. I squared my shoulders and stepped inside. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and worn fabric seats, a hushed tension hanging in the air as supporters filled the back rows, veterans in faded caps, a few journalists nursing coffee cups, Claire Reed smoothing her skirt at the defense table while Gallagher's team whispered among themselves. I took my place at the plaintiff's stand, sliding my folder onto the polished surface so my nameplate caught the overhead light, Major General Samantha Carter, USAF. Behind me, Marcus Lee sat at the tech table adjusting his laptop to display the blockchain node verification screens. The judge, an imposing woman with salt and pepper hair and a gaze honed by decades on the bench, called the hearing to order. Gallagher rose first, voice crisp. He argued Grandpa's paper, while dated 2 weeks before his passing, supersedes any digital document, citing state law and tradition. Then it was Claire's turn. She laid out the notarized blockchain entries, the time-stamped digital signatures, the multi-node authentication logs that proved immutability and Grandpa's lack of subsequent revocation. The judge listened, finger-steepled eyes flitting between the chip's holographic projection and the aged parchment Gallagher produced. I felt the adrenaline flicker within me as she turned to Marcus. Marcus cleared his throat and spoke with calm authority about how blockchain, unlike paper, Resist tampering because it's distributed across thousands of nodes. Gallagher pounced, challenging the technology as esoteric and beyond legal recognition, likening it to science fiction. A murmur rippled through the gallery. I caught Naomi Patel's eye in the spectator seats, her look steady encouragement. I'd learned from her how cognitive bias can warp belief, how people fear what they don't understand. I leaned forward, ready to speak if called upon. But Marcus held his ground, walking the judge through each validation step, making the intangible feel concrete. By the time he finished, the courtroom sat in startled silence, and Gallagher's jaw clenched like a steel trap. Next came Naomi's testimony. She described Grandpa's mental fitness evaluations after his stroke, noting that he insisted on digitizing his will precisely to safeguard it against paper's fragility. Gallagher's counsels tried to frame her as a hired expert and friend of the plaintiff, suggesting bias. He asked if she'd been influenced by my rank by loyalty to the Space Force. Naomi paused, then fixed her gaze on him. I base my conclusions on documented medical records and cognitive assessments, she said. My duty is to truth, not rank. That declaration hung in the air like a bell. For the first time, I felt a thread of triumph. Not arrogance, but relief that the jury of one judge might see past privilege to the reality of Grandpa's intent. Then came the twist I hadn't fully anticipated. Gallagher called surprise witness Victoria Carter, my sister, who strode to the stand with all her polished poise. The judge allowed it under rebuttal evidence, and before I could protest, Victoria held up a briefcase of documents and a USB drive. She claimed that Grandpa's original paper will had been misplaced, but later found, and that he'd expressly revoked any digital version after a family meeting last November. Claire objected, but the judge let the evidence in for weight. Victoria plugged the USB into the courtroom's screen and pressed play on a home video, our parents and Grandpa seated by the Christmas tree laughing. Except halfway through, Grandpa's voice cut in saying, "Don't let Sam anywhere near my desk after I'm gone. She'll turn everything to code and forget her roots." The judge frowned. Suddenly, Victoria's carefully scripted narrative unraveled. Her father's admonition sounded more like playfulness than legal revocation. The video froze on Grandpa's smirking face, and a hidden microphone picked up Mom whispering, "We'll handle the inheritance our way." The gallery erupted. I pressed my lips together, remembering Grandpa's quiet warning that some truths hide behind laughter. This evidence, unintentionally revealing collusion, shifted the courtroom's momentum back toward us. With emotions roiling, it was Ethan's turn. He stood hesitant but resolute and handed the judge a new USB. He explained that back on Thanksgiving, Mom had left voicemails on my office line before the paper will's date, in which she spoke fondly of the Starlink chip, calling it Grandpa's lifeline for you if the worst happened. Gallagher squawked about authenticity, but when the audio played, Mom's clear voice thanking Grandpa for safeguarding his legacy digitally, a hush fell so deep I felt the cathedral ceilings ringing. The judge's eyes flickered between the chip in my pocket and the playback, and I realized that Grandpa had planned for every loophole. His faith in technology wasn't just a quirk, he predicted a family desperate to rewrite the script. That genius of foresight encoded in the chip's ledger felt like Grandpa reaching out across time to fight alongside me. Charles Yates then took the stand to walk the judge through every dollar diverted. Every shell company dissolved matching names to wire transfers that began the day I shipped out for deployment. Gallagher objected to chain of custody, calling the digital records circumstantial. So I rose, surprising even myself, and recounted step by step how I'd retrieved the chip from Grandpa's safe deposit box, logged it into a secure evidence locker with audio-visual record of seal intact, and personally transferred it to Claire's custody with notarized signatures. I spoke without falter, my voice echoing with the same authority I used in mission briefings. When I finished, the gallery stirred no longer just a uniform, but a person reclaiming her story. The judge nodded silent approval in her eyes. In closing, Claire urged the court to honor Grandpa's last wishes to choose substance over form, to recognize that justice adapts as society evolves. Gallagher countered with tradition, begging the court to trust paper over pixels. The judge leaned back, gaze pensive. I felt the room contract as she announced a recess to deliberate. Reporters surged forward, but I slipped out of the courtroom straight to the quiet table set up on the plaza. I poured mugs of cocoa for waiting veterans, forcing a smile as they cheered quietly, unaware of the day's drama. I handed out bagels, each one a simple promise to keep fighting for them, but inside, I was a knot of anticipation and dread. I could almost hear the judge's gavel echoing in the chamber. As dusk settled and neon signs flickered on, my phone buzzed with Jasmine's text. Decision at 6 p.m. My breath caught. I tucked the Starlink chip into my palm, feeling its edges against my skin, and whispered, "We're not finished yet." Then I looked up at the courthouse steps, imagining the judge's final word, and felt the weight of every hope and fear converge in the space between the chip and the gavel. The moment of truth was coming, and I was ready, whatever it cost. My phone buzzed at exactly 6:00 p.m. with that little red notification banner I'd been dreading and hoping for all day. I unlocked the screen, found the surrogate's court live feed, and watched as Judge Sinclair cleared her throat and read her decision. "The injunction is denied," she said, voice measured. "The digital will stored on the Starlink chip is legally valid, and this court recognizes its time-stamped immutability. The beneficiary's fund may proceed." My chest felt like it had just cracked open, relief and euphoria flooding through me so fast I had to sit down against the courthouse wall. Reporters around me started shouting questions, but I could only stare at the glowing screen, the words "denied" and "valid" ringing louder than any victory celebration. I pressed my thumb against my chest where the chip rested, the cool metal grounding me. Grandpa's voice echoed in my mind. "Carry yourself, kiddo." In that moment, I realized I had done it. I'd forced my family to see the truth, and the law had finally backed me up. But even as relief washed over me, a flicker of unease whispered that victory on paper was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. Barely 10 minutes later, I found myself cornered by Jasmine Torres for an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. Microphones collided in front of me, like migratory birds, each reporter hungry for a quote. I tightened my shoulders and cleared my throat. "Today isn't just about me," I said, voice steady. "It's about honoring my grandfather's legacy and supporting those who served this country. The Carter Veterans Fund will open its doors next week. We're here to serve, not to punish." I gestured to the veterans gathered behind me, their caps and jackets, a patchwork of service branches and eras. Cameras flashed as one old Marine in the back raised his hand and saluted. I returned the salute, aware that I was officially no longer the disgraced daughter, but the general who'd played by different rules and won. As reporters crowded around for sound bites, I felt a surge of pride so raw it almost burned. Yet behind the flashing bulbs, I saw my parents' faces on TV monitors, ashen mouths set in thin lines, and I knew the war at home wasn't over. Within an hour, I slipped away to the quiet table, the modest breakfast cart I'd set up 2 weeks ago, under an awning on 10th Avenue. It was already crowded with veterans in hoodies and dog tags, men and women who'd traded rifles for coffee mugs, and quietly thanked me as I handed out bagels and fruit. Here, my uniform meant warmth and a hot meal, not headlines or scandal. When I poured the first cup of black coffee, an army sergeant in a battered cap pressed his hand to his heart and said, "Ma'am, you did right by us." His words were simple, but they ignited something deeper than any courtroom ruling, a reminder that service wasn't measured in legal victories, but in human connection. I smiled, handing cups around like warm introductions, feeling the chip's weight in my pocket, a symbol of Grandpa's foresight and my own fight for something bigger than inheritance. Yet as I stirred sugar into a veteran's mug, I caught sight of a local news van across the street. Camera pointed straight at us. Even here, where kindness was supposed to live, the glare of scrutiny found its way in. By sundown, social media was ablaze. Justice for Carter Fund trended with heartfelt messages, veterans posting selfies with their coffee cups, students praising tech-forward wills, strangers thanking me for standing up to old money dynasties. But right beside those supportive tweets were angry threads. "She's abusing her rank." "Digital wills are dangerous precedent." "Family drama aired in public, shameful." A neighborhood Facebook group debated whether my cart was a public nuisance. Another called me a corporate heiress playing soldier. I scrolled through comments that trashed the Space Force, accused me of grandstanding, or pored over the minutiae of my uniform's metal placements. At first, I felt the old familiar sting of invisibility. The doubt that maybe I was too harsh, too public. But then I remembered the veterans' faces this morning, eyes hopeful over steaming mugs, and I realized that for every keyboard critic, there was someone who needed a warm bagel and proof that someone cared. The chip felt heavier than its cold logic clashing with the messiness of public opinion. Grandpa's experiment in tech had prevailed in court, but there was a social battle unfolding that no blockchain could settle. The next morning, I got a call from the city clerk's office. A permit challenge had been filed against my veteran's cart. A small group of residents claimed unauthorized commercial activity and demanded inspections. The irony stung. My own family hadn't done that. Random neighbors had. If I didn't appear at a city hearing within 48 hours, they could fine me or shut me down. I sat at my kitchen table, chip on display next to my coffee mug, and weighed my options. This wasn't a mission for drones or briefs. It was a fight in local government with petty regulations and biased neighbors. I could throw money at lawyers to fight it, but that felt like the old Carter way, using privilege to silence dissent. Instead, I decided to leverage community support. I drafted an open letter explaining the fund's mission, posted it to a veterans nonprofit network, and arranged a town hall at the local community center. I'd show up in uniform, answer questions, create transparency. Risky maybe, but if I hid behind legal victories, I'd lose the grassroots support that mattered more than any judge's ruling. I clicked send on my email and watched the chip glint in the morning sunlight, a symbol of Grandpa's belief that truth once revealed couldn't be erased. That night, sleep was elusive. I lay awake listening to the city hum, the distant wail of sirens, the whoosh of subway trains. Doubt seeped in. What if I couldn't sustain the fund? What if the legal victory vanished on appeal? What if my parents used every loophole left to squeeze me out again? But then I touched the chip, tracing the words for kiddo with my thumb, and felt the firmness of its edge. Grandpa had known betrayal, and he'd built against it with code. His silent vote had been for me against those who'd tried to erase me. I breathed in and out, feeling something calm settle into my chest. This fight was more than money or legacy. It was about dignity, community, evolving with the times. If Grandpa could entrust his final wishes to a network of satellites and nodes, I could entrust this fight to the people who believed in me and the veterans counting on a warm meal. With that thought anchoring me, I finally closed my eyes. Early the next morning, before dawn, I was at City Hall with a handful of veterans, Claire and 2 volunteers from the nonprofit. We filled the hearing room with dog tags and uniforms printouts of the judge's decision in our hands. The clerk called the case Carter Veterans Fund Permit Challenge. Across the room sat a handful of neighbors and a lawyer clutching city code books. As I began my testimony, explaining that the cart wasn't for profit, that it served a public good, that the community needed it more than ever, I felt the familiar surge of purpose that had carried me through boot camp and court hearings. I watched the neighbors' expressions shift from skepticism to awkward respect as veterans offered heartfelt statements. The lawyer objected, but the clerk cut him off, thanking him and moving on. At the hearing's end, the clerk looked at me and said, "Permit granted, effective immediately." I exhaled so hard I thought I might laugh. Yet even as relief spread, I sensed the next ripple on the horizon, a personal email from Victoria, subject line, "Cease and desist." My chest tightened again. The next battle wasn't legal or social, it was personal. And I had just enough time to brace myself before the storm. Late that night, my phone buzzed with a private message from an unrecognized number. "General Carter, this is Admiral Hernandez. We've detected an unauthorized access attempt on your blockchain asset. Someone probed the network for your chip's private key last night. Be careful. They know where to find you." I stared at the screen, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the hum of my apartment. The chip lay on my desk, innocuous as always, but now a target. My grandfather had protected his will with code, but someone was trying to hack it. And if they succeeded, they could rewrite history. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every decision I'd made public fight community trust, open hearings. Now the battlefield had shifted into cyberspace, and the enemy was hidden behind lines of code and shadows. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at the chip's silver surface under my desk lamp, and whispered, "All right, kiddo, Let's see who's brave enough to face me next. The night felt suddenly too quiet. The city lights cold witnesses to an unseen war that had only just begun. I woke before dawn, the city still draped in velvet darkness, and my phone buzzed again, another alert from Admiral Hernandez. Unusual hash traffic on Grandpa's Will ledger. Attempted override from 2 IP addresses traced to Carter Energy's HQ. I sat up in bed, heart hammering. Carter Energy, my father's old empire. They were launching a digital coup to wrest the fund and Grandpa's legacy back into their hands. I slipped into my uniform pants, grabbed the Starlink chip from its protective case, and headed straight to Marcus Lee's makeshift command center in my apartment's spare bedroom. The hum of his NVIDIA-powered rig filled the room as he ran packet captures and reverse proxies. "They're using a man-in-the-middle attack," he said, eyes glued to cascading lines of code. "They spoofed a node with a certificate stolen from your parents' corporate server. If we don't shut this down in the next 15 minutes, they'll rewrite the ledger entry that names you sole trustee." My fingers itched for the emergency kill switch blockchain transactions can't be undone, but I could quarantine Grandpa's will in a time-locked smart contract until we proved authenticity. That was risky if I miscalculated the entire fund would freeze, denying veterans their breakfasts. But letting Dad's company hijack Grandpa's legacy was unthinkable. I swallowed hard, remembering Grandpa's words. "Secure your future like you'd secure your life, kiddo." I gave Marcus the nod. He typed a terminal command that sent a multi-signature auth request to the network, triggering a rapid consensus update that locked out the rogue node. For a tense minute, nothing happened. Then the console lit up, access denied, ledger integrity maintained. Relief washed over me, so hot I felt dizzy. I grabbed the chip, held it close as though it were Grandpa's hand. But as the city outside stirred to life, I realized the war was far from over. My father had just signaled that no tactic was too dirty to reclaim the family fortune. Later that morning, I convened my core team, Claire Reed, Charles Yates, Naomi Patel, and Ethan, around the quiet table, now relocated next to the Veterans Center we'd opened under the overpass on 42nd Street. The sign above it simply read, "Carter Veterans Table," a modest wooden plank that had become a beacon for homeless vets. Veterans lined up for coffee and breakfast burritos, their gratitude palpable, but my mind was on my next move. I laid out the printouts of the intrusion logs, traced IP ranges back to Carter Energy's Connecticut office, and passed around screenshots of code signatures matching files I'd once signed in their compliance system. Naomi listened in stunned silence, and Ethan's jaw clenched every time he looked at Dad's corporate logo stamped in the packet headers. Claire steepled her fingers. "We can file a civil suit for digital trespass and fraud, but that could take months meanwhile the fund's exposed." I took a sip of coffee, its bitterness snapping me back to focus. "We do both," I said. "Immediate injunction against Carter Energy to prevent further attacks and criminal referral to the DOJ's Cybercrime Division. Grandpa didn't just make a will, he built a fortress. Now we use every weapon in its arsenal." Charles added, "I'll coordinate with the bank to escalate security on all accounts. We'll implement multi-factor wallet authentication, fingerprint plus Face ID, plus time-based one-time passwords tied to your personal device." Ethan looked at me, concern etched in his eyes. "Sam, you'll be up against your own family in federal court. Are you ready for that?" I met his gaze, feeling the strength that had carried me through boot camp deployments and courtrooms. "I'm beyond ready," I said. "This is bigger than us. It's about honoring Grandpa's vision for solidarity, not entitlement." The team nodded a quiet pact, forming in the morning air, sealed over chipped ceramic mugs and steaming breakfast burritos. By mid-afternoon, I stood before a panel of federal prosecutors in a hushed conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I presented the intrusion data, the consensus logs, the bank account freeze requests, and the transcripts of CNBC segments where Dad had publicly lamented my reckless leadership of the fund. The lawyers drilled me motive, methods, damages. I laid out the cyber forensics metadata pointing to Carter Energy's VPN, a link between their GoDaddy domain and the spoofed SSL certificate. I summarized Charles's testimony that Grandpa's will was stored on a permissioned blockchain, not an open one, meaning every node was pre-approved by Grandpa's estate and me. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Malik nodded gravely. We'll open a criminal investigation into unauthorized access to a protected computer system. Wire fraud and conspiracy. We'll also seek an emergency restraining order to lock out Carter Energy's IT team from any further attempts. I exhaled as if I'd been holding my breath for days. Thank you, I said. Justice is about more than punishment. It's about protecting the vulnerable. As I left the building, sunlight reflected off the chip's silver surface in my palm, reminding me that technology could be wielded for good or twisted for greed. My father had chosen the latter. Now it was my turn to decide what kind of legacy I'd build. That evening, I walked the perimeter of our Veterans Center, watching as volunteers served hot soup and distributed blankets. A young Marine veteran named Raul Salazar approached me, his eye patch, an amputated leg, a testament to battles lost and won. "General," he said quietly, "you saved this place. I don't know what you're fighting, but know we've got your six." He meant it, they all did. I pressed the Starlink chip into my palm, noting how the metal felt warmer, now infused with our collective resolve. "I've got yours, Raul," I replied. "Always." He nodded and rejoined the line. I watched him disappear into the flickering halogen light that bathed the center and realized that my fight wasn't just against crooked family or corporate greed. It was against the idea that service and sacrifice could be erased by money. Here, in the glow of car headlights and tent flaps, I saw the truest measure of honor, human dignity, preserved through small acts of kindness. A knock on the door of my trailer startled me. It was Victoria, her face pale under the harsh street lamp glare. "We need to talk," she said, voice trembling. I gestured her inside, careful to keep the Veterans Center in sight. She entered, eyes darting among the sleeping cots. I tried to warn Dad," she stammered. I told him that hacking Grandpa's will would destroy the family's reputation. He didn't listen. She looked at the chip in my hand. I helped him get the certificate, but stopped short of the attack. "I thought it'd be enough to spook you into giving up." My chest tightened. "You thought theft and intimidation would make me walk away." She shook her head, tears welling. "I was scared. I thought if Dad lost control of his legacy, he'd push me out too." I stared at her, seeing not just my sister, but a fellow soldier trapped by expectations. "Sister," I said softly, "loyalty isn't about stealing what doesn't belong to you. It's protecting people who can't protect themselves." She swallowed, voice husky. "I want to help fix this." "I'm sorry." I held out the chip. "Then help us secure it. Help us support these veterans. You can test your mettle here, not by tearing down Grandpa's fort, but by building ours together." Victoria's shoulders sagged, relief and shame intermingling. She nodded. In that gesture, I felt a new front open, not just legal battles, but the chance to heal fractured blood ties, if only I could trust her again. But just as I allowed a sliver of hope, my phone buzzed with a text from Admiral Hernandez. Major General classified intel suggests Carter Energy is lobbying for contract awards on our Space Force satellite networks. Be prepared for political pushback. My teeth clenched. The same family that undermined Grandpa's will now aimed to leverage national security contracts to crush me. I looked out at the Veterans Center, at laundry drying on makeshift lines, at the rising steam from coffee urns. My fight had evolved from family betrayal to corporate espionage to political warfare. I pressed the chip in my palm, feeling its enduring solidity, a symbol forged by my grandfather's foresight. He'd expected resistance. He coded his legacy to survive the fiercest storms. Now I would do the same for the veterans, for my sister, for myself. I squared my shoulders and whispered into the night, "Bring it on. Tomorrow the real war begins."